All right. So our first presentation is by Agnese Martini, Francesca Corradini, and Matteo Porazzi. And their presentation is titled Anthropogenic Monsters, a cast and liberating perspective on the contemporary production of human, non-human monsters. Are you all set?
Hi, everyone. We're now going to share the screen. Can you all see? Yeah.
Looks good.
Thank you. We're going to present on our chapter, which is going to be published on the collection of essay expanding the critical animal studies imagination. And so, first of all, we will try to understand what is a monster, which is the main theme of our chapter. In fact, human imagination has always been haunted by monsters, often described as beings of anomalous shape or fabulous creatures. But what constitutes a monster in the first place? Etymologically, monster derives from the Latin monstrum, which is related to the verbs mostrare, which means to show, reveal, or signify, and monere, to warn. In fact, the monster in the past was a prodigy, revealing a message from God. But what if monsters still have a message to transmit? What can they reveal? Do they have something to warn us about? As argued by Foucault, on the basis of the continuum held by nature, the monster ensures the emergence of difference. In fact, monsters inhabit liminal spaces, and precisely from this borderline position, they problematize identity, categorization, and order. So, the power of monsters is to deconstruct and challenge, just by existing, our reality and norms. Monsters lead us to question our worldview. They expose how it can be inadequate. And finally, they can make us acknowledge the failures of our system. In this sense, the monstrous body can be considered a critical tool to reevaluate our cultural paradigms and our perception of differences. So in this work, our focus is on the contemporary production of human and non-human monsters, proposing that monstrosity can be a relevant category for critical animal studies. For our research, we took inspiration from a varied literature, moving among trans studies, queer theory, posthumanism. In this context, we decided to call contemporary monsters anthropogenic because their production depends directly on human activities or indirectly on human discourses. So first, Francesca will look at the serial production of non-human monsters through genetic modification, both in the scientific laboratory and in the meat industry. Then Matteo will consider the proliferation of human monsters in the cultural imaginary through the discrimination and animalization of non-conforming bodies, such as the disabled, Black, and trans people. Finally, I will try to explore how monsters can reveal unexpected pathways in order to overcome anthropocentrism and speciesism, which represent core themes and goals for critical animal studies.
Okay, so our chapter begins with the description of the multi-phase monstrosity that society creates and reproduces through the logic and practice of laboratory testing and in intensive animal farming, contributing to a serial production of monstrous non-human animal bodies. Despite not being originally conceived in relation to intensive farmed animals, we used Foucault legacy to illustrate the way in which, during the development of capitalism, the disciplining of human and non-human animal bodies has been interlaced. In this way, we conceive biopower as an heuristic tool for thinking about relation across species. We have identified in this chapter two main examples of what we call anthropogenic non-human monsters. The first is the oncomouse, a genetically engineered laboratory model used in breast cancer research. It was created in 1983 at Harvard University by two scientists, Philip Leader and Timothy Stewart, becoming in the 1988 the first animal to be patented in the US. The oncomouse is a mouse genetically modified to have an active gene, an active cancer gene, becoming a non-human animals with an expiration date projected for human scientific purposes within the oncological research. As ROE affirms, as a model, the transgenic mouse is both a trope and a tool that reconfigures biological knowledge, laboratory practice, property law, economic fortunes, and the collective personal hopes and fears. From that moment on, mice are the most and best chosen model in laboratory research, mainly because they mature early and breed very fast, making it easy to reproduce in large scale and serial forms. The other non-human animal that we are choosing come from the industrial environment is the broiler chicken. Particularly broilers are chicken shaped by intensive human intervention, and they are unable to live without this human intervention. Their muscular flesh in a matter of weeks reach a weight that they are unable to sustain. And for this reason, they are mostly affected by multiple diseases, osteopathology, viruses, problems related to the growth of vital organs, such as heart and leg, and significant changes in gravity center, leading to decreased their life expectancy. We have traced monstrosity in the process of multiplication and simplification of industrial animal farming, because these non-human animals are reduced to the level of operability, while individuality, variation, agency are erased. Reading the bodies of the monstrous creation of the oncomouse and broiler chicken, it is possible to decrypt an embedded narrative of human supremacy and exceptionalism. These monsters warn us, revealing the contradiction and contraindication of our system. In the case of the chickens, by feeding on their hormone and preservative-rich meat, we unleash in ourselves the monsters we have created. As far as oncomouse is concerned, the intervened agency between human and non-human animals occurs at a more intimate level within the fleshes of human and non-human. Now, Matteo.
Okay. After looking at how non-human animals can become anthropogenic monsters due to human interference, we're now going to look at how anthropogenic monstrosity can also be displayed through human bodies, human animal bodies. The main difference between the two is that while non-human monsters are materially produced by human activities, human monsters are instead ideologically created by human discourses that are based on differences. In order to exemplify what I just said, we have analyzed two different stories. The first one is a fictional story of Animal from the book Animals People of Indra Sina. And the second one instead is drawn from a controversial lecture that the Spanish philosopher Plo Preciado held in 2019 at the École de la Cause Freudienne, that is also present in the book Can the Monster Speak? But let's start with Animals People, a novel that talks about Animal, a 6-year-old kid who is orphan and who has lost his ability to stand on 2 legs due to a poisoning from a chemical leak of a US corporation in the fictitious city of Kafur. Animal, of course, is not his real name, but is a degrading nickname given to him by his peers due to his physical condition. The animalization of this kid is considered degrading only because for the majority of people, being associated to an animal remove them from a top-place position in a species hierarchical system. And therefore, in this way, they are denied of their privileges associated with the full human status. However, animals' position is quite different because animal sees this imposed animality as a similarity to the condition of any other animal, and it is shown throughout the book, also through a way of forgetting about his past pivotal life. In fact, the sentence that I have highlighted in this slide, "I used to be a human once, so I'm told I don't remember it myself," is one of the first sentences of the book, in which animal is clearly forgetting about the past. But aside from this process of animalization, another layer of analysis that we have taken into consideration is how can be considered an anthropogenic monster. So we have noticed that animal's condition was not just based on his disability, but instead it derives also from his condition of being a poor kid living in a colonized country. These two facts derive from the penetration and violation of industrialized imperial forces. And therefore, we can state that animal's monstrosity, in a sense, is deriving from human irresponsibility. And so we can consider him an anthropogenic monster in a sense. But let's move on to the second story. The second story we have analyzed has been the speech given by the philosopher Paul Preciado in 2019 in front of 3,500 psychoanalysts. He talked about his experience of being a trans man, referring to himself as a subject of impossible metamorphosis. It derives from the clinical beliefs that trans men are incapable of resolving certain complexes and envies that they have towards cisgender men. And Preciado stated that this type of discourses transformed him into a monster. And the sentence that I have highlighted in this slide is pivotal because it's the first time that Preciado makes use of the word monster. And through that, he's able to outline that this monstrosity is human-imposed. And the monster's identity that he's describing detaches from the concept of gender-sex binaries. For Preciado, a monster is neither a man nor a woman, but someone who lives in transition. And with that, Preciado wants to overcome the heteropatriarchal system. He's calling for a radical transformation in the field of psychoanalysis. He is asking mutants, monsters, and those that are able to break boundaries to contribute for a collective construction of a different epistemology of the living human body. So in a sense, we can consider also that Animal and Preciado share some commonalities because they both embraced monstrosity and they found a strength into it. And despite the negative connotation of the term, these people coming from marginalized groups are reclaiming their difference and they are appropriating monstrosity as a means of resistance. In this way, they are able to create a political strategy that is disrupting a long-standing system of power that is based on practices of exclusion, repression, and silencing of them and the so-called others. But this is something that Agnès is going to explain further in detail, so I'm going to leave her the floor.
In this final section, I will try to further develop the idea of embracing monstrosity, showing how it can lead to new perspectives on total liberation. In fact, disrupting categories and boundaries, monsters show new version of reality. And when monsters enter into the domain of reality, they cannot just be assimilated into prevailing norms. Instead, they open norms to resignification. This is why monsters can reveal unexpected pathways, create multi-species alliances, question the concept of what is natural and unnatural, dismantle hierarchies, and in this way lead to the liberation of both humans and non-humans. To explain this monstrous turn, as Haraway would call it, I chose two key works, the essay My Words to Victor Frankenstein by the trans scholar and activist Susan Stryker, and the book La mostruosi trans by the Italian trans activist Filo Sottile. Starting with Stryker, in her work, she acknowledges the trans body as an unnatural body, a technological construction, since the trans body is reconfigured in another shape compared to the one in which it was born. From this position, she finds a deep affinity with the monster in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, since she's perceived as less than fully human because of the means of her embodiment, just like Preciado. Nevertheless, Stryker affirms the power of her monstrous body and declares, I am transsexual and therefore I am a monster. In doing so, she reclaims the word monster for the trans community, just as other slurs have been reclaimed by other marginalized groups, because by embracing and accepting this, we dispel their ability to harm. But this is not just a linguistic proclamation. In fact, it allows us to further question the structure of society and reality itself. In fact, we can read in this quote, as in the case of being called it, being called a creature suggests the lack of or loss of a superior personhood. I find no shame, however, in acknowledging my egalitarian relationship with non-human material being. That is what makes monsters dangerous. They show that things can be otherwise than you thought. They come to announce the overturning of reality and to reveal a new one in which there are no hierarchies and no categorization. Creatures are all equally made and equally unnatural. Stryker does not feel degraded in being called a creature. Instead, she reverses the process of animalization by recognizing new egalitarian relations with the non-human. In fact, the same speciesist anthropocentric system condones and allows both the discrimination of human minorities and, at the same time, the arbitrary abuse of non-human animals. But once we see equality in animalization and not degradation, we might pursue liberation for all animals, human and non-human. Nevertheless, this liberation can also be violent. Stryker's call to her fellow creatures is also raging, and precisely starting from this rage, Filo Sottile invokes a trans-feminist alliance among monstrous creatures in order to riot. In fact, in this passage, she says, we monstrous creatures do not guarantee you from poisoning, contagion, contamination. We come to announce the subversion of nature, the fall under furious blows of tails, legs, fangs, trunks, tentacles of the heteropatriarchy. Just like Haraway's vampires, the monstrous creatures of Filo Sottile contaminate and pollute. They are vectors of transfection and transformation. And precisely this idea of poisoning, contagion, threatens fantasies of order, purity, categorization. This is why monsters make taxonomies impossible and boundaries leaky. They are entangled in sticky, messy, turbid relationships. In this sense, monsters aren't against nature because nature itself is already inappropriated and monstrous. As Haraway would say, we already are in the womb of a pregnant monster. Once we realize that we all come from the same anarchic womb and the same matrix of possibilities, we can start making oddkin and alliances, entering multi-species conversations. In fact, Sottile uses, not by chance, axomorphic language when talking about the subversion of nature. The fall of this heteropatriarchal, anthropocentric, speciesist society that oppresses both human and non-human animals can happen only if we include non-human agencies and subjectivities in our alliances. So, in conclusion, we envision a total liberation based on practices of multi-species care and solidarity, becoming with other than humans in monstrous, non-naturalist and off-category relationships. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Agnese, Francesca, and Matteo. Yeah, so I really like this topic. And how you deal with it, how you approach it. You mentioned that it's going to be a chapter, and I am an editor of the book. They mentioned at the beginning that it is going in, so I have read this chapter and I'm very familiar with it. I think it's really well done, really well written, and pulled together. So thank you for presenting on this. This was great to see. So I want to open the time up here for questions. If anyone would like to ask the presenters a question, I'll give a little bit of time here to see if anyone would like to type anything in. Remember the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Please click there and enter any questions there if you have them. I know sometimes it takes a little while for people to maybe think of them or type them or something like that. All right, we got someone using the Q&A app. Not a question, but that's okay. That's okay. Thanks for participating, for being here. So to maybe give a little more time, I would, well, let's see. Oh, we got a question. Looks like maybe it was cut off just a little bit. Teo, did you, there we go. Got maybe the rest of the question here. Okay, so we have a question. Teo is wondering how racializing assemblages. I'm not sure what's the word, somehow affect mechanics of monstrous oppression. So probably maybe skew, how racializing assemblages skew the mechanics of monstrous oppression. So, would y'all like to respond to that? Basically, how racialized dynamics probably might come into play.
Well, it became natural to think about natural in a sense to think about racializing probably when you are taking into consideration someone that is probably from a country that has been colonized. For instance, in Animal Story, the race take an important part in it, because we have like a condition in which basically this kid is subjected to anonymization also due to his social condition, not just on his body condition. So in this way, monster take a second meaning probably to the classic meaning of monster that is more on a physical side rather than just a physical side. It's also like a more of a social cultural yeah paradigm. So that's probably how the racial can take place.
Yeah, in general, our main thesis was that monsters are not born monsters, they are made into monsters, in the sense that the monster body is a cultural body. And so we try to show how, in this sense, for example, racialization, which is something that comes from our culture, can be a way of creating new monsters that still don't say anything about their condition. They say more about what we perceive as the norm, and the norm often becomes also normative, and then there is the problem. I don't know if
Yeah,
we answered that question.
if we answered.
right. Well, yeah, so Teo, who asked the question, is of course free to follow up. And so just kind of along that line, while maybe waiting, Teo does not have to respond to anything, but does the book in the book, what is it? Is Animals People?
Animals People,
yeah. Is animals race made a big deal of, or is that just kind of, I don't know, it affects like his general situation, but is it kind of explicit in the story, his race, or is it more implicit?
It says that is a native Indian, basically. I mean, he was born and raised in the fictitious city that there's in the book. So we know for a fact that he is we assume that he is Indian, but maybe it's more like he was born there, so we think that he is Indian in a sense. So it is not. It is more implicitly say his nationality or everything, but in general, I would say that it's more of a rereading of that, like is a subtle message that you can read in the old discourse. It is not explicitly said, but of course, seeing that the all chemical leak or the chemical disasters in a book are caused by an American company, there's this play that takes place in a conversation. So that's probably how we can see his race taking a form, basically, in a discourse.
Okay, yeah, thank you. All right, so we do have another, maybe a couple questions, but so there's one ready. So we have the difference marker of monster is always embodied in a body. So what happens with the actual strategies of one of the sectors that produces monsters? So the question means like the meat industry that is displacing the animal body as an intervention, and now is so trying to produce meat through tissues or tissue engineering. So this is a topic particularly that I know about and was wondering about this. So what are the implications for the category of monster, maybe here?
That's interesting.
No, that is really interesting, like to reflect on the ethics of artificial meat. So there is no actual suffering of the animal. There is no exploitation of the animal in the animal farming, but it is still created from an original animal tissue. I don't know, I think it's a very complex issue. I don't think I have a clear answer. It is definitely connected to, I don't know, when we think about the distinction between what is natural and what is artificial, what is technological, and how much we want to integrate the two aspects. We already know that nothing is natural, like there is nothing as natural. So to which extent we should accept this sort of contamination of what is in some sense technological and what is not. I don't know, it could be very interesting to deepen this aspect for sure. Thank you for discussing, because it was really interesting and we will think about this.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the idea of this, whatever you want to call it, in vitro meat or cultured meat, maybe, and the idea of monstrosity. I was thinking of that in terms of being like pieced together as well, because that's largely how that's made, by putting in the various components of meat to create something that, well, you know, is maybe debatable. That's not the point here, but you know, to be meat or not, but it's not living to begin with, at least on its own, really. So how the idea of monstrosity might, you know, work there or not is kind of interesting. Yeah, so thanks. And yeah, you know, that might be more difficult to answer if especially because that kind of stuff is still new. It doesn't really exist, so they haven't, you know, been able to really look at that.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's see, do we have, Darren was working on something? You able to get a question in, Darren? We can also always type a question either into the Q&A panel if that's not working for you, which it might not be for Darren. And you can type a question into the chat if you have to. Q&A is preferred first if possible, and questions can always be answered after a presenter's done as well, and just typing it into the chat. Okay, here we go. We got it. So Darren is asking, so one more for you all. So just following up on from the racializing question. So based on your research, do you think the oppressive views towards monstrosity is pervasive across culture or more exclusively Western colonial, right, phenomena? Have you come across cultures that have significantly different, perhaps more liberatory views on monsters and monstrosity?
That is actually very interesting, like how our perspective was on definitely the concept of monstrosity in the Western society that we took as, I don't know, the leading society in this worldview of anthropocentrism and speciesism. So that was the main start. And in fact, in the chapter, we also deepen a little bit more the history of the concept of monstrosity, and in particular, how it was perceived in Middle Age, in early modern Europe, and then on the 20th and 21st century, because we saw this disconnection of the monster so as a message from the divine, and then it's secularized as a concept, but it's still a message, more political, more about political issues. So we focus mainly on this evolution of the concept of monstrosity from we can say the ancient times in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, then Middle Age, and then still in the Western side and in Europe, because we wanted somehow to criticize that kind of society. So this is why we didn't consider other, for example, from Eastern or
Yeah.
But it could be interesting, I think.
Yeah.
This is an interesting question. Yes,
Mhm.
there's many research due about this theme because it's very wide. The monstrosity is very wide. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. That is an interesting question. And I guess you three you use Susan Stryker a lot in your chapter. And that probably makes sense given her essay, relating transgender to Frankenstein's monster. But of course, Susan Stryker will have her own limitations, which she of course also admits in her book on transgender history as well, like her positionality. So being from the West and the United States also. So maybe that's just kind of part of it too, is it, where you're partly basing this makes sense, but that person kind of comes out of the West as well. But so yeah, different cultural perspectives on that would be certainly a great other question, and maybe other direction or something else to look into. Okay, great. So thank you all.
thank you
For that presentation, yes, and answering the questions. And if anyone else wants to continue to ask presentations or presenters questions after they've presented, as long as they're able to stick around, you can do that in the Q&A, and we can try to type answers or have something like going there as well. Okay, so we will move on to the second presentation today. And so the second presentation is by Varun Joshi. Although Varun, due to personal circumstances shortly before this event, is not able to attend in person, but being the very caring and loyal person Varun is, he did manage to do his presentation as a video, and so I am going to show that here today. And because I'm showing the video and Varun isn't able to be here, we won't have the option to ask Varun questions, which is a little unfortunate, but we are very fortunate to still have Varun's presentation. I think this should be very interesting, but people are free to still ask questions of Varun's presentation, and he told me I can relay him questions and we can try to get answers back to you if you would like. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, so I suppose would someone maybe be able to confirm that you can see the presentation up here?
I can see it, yeah.
Okay, good, thank you. Oh, shoot. Oh, sorry, oh wait, I have to stop for a second. Sorry, with the closed captions on, that's in the way of me starting this presentation. So I have to figure out a way to do that real quick. Shoot, let me stop. Stop sharing. I gotta turn these closed captions off real quick, I think. Okay, let me try this again. Okay, so it should be Varun's presentation is only about 16 minutes long. Those are the reproduction of violence, resistance to cow vigilantism. Sorry, here we go. Okay, sorry to interrupt. I have heard maybe that there is at least some with no audio. Are others? Yeah, okay, others maybe not able to hear. Hmm. Okay, so it looks like we have panelists not being able to hear. Yeah. Are the other audience member, are the other attendees able to hear? You'll be able to type that in the chat, someone, and let me know. It's still an issue. All right, I'll trying to see. Okay, yeah, someone else can't hear. All right, thanks for letting me know. Yeah, Darren, the audio box. I mean, I think it is like checked and on, as far as I can tell. Shoot. Chat is disabled. Oh. Dang. All right, shoot. Not exactly sure what to do with this.
Up in the early 1900s and more organized than ever as a way to protest the British implementation of slaughterhouses in the Indus region. Slaughterhouses were seen as a violation between human and animal relationality amongst individuals in India, not just Hindus. So cow protectionism is not solely a religious phenomenon in India. Now, cow slaughter in India is it's a bit of a tricky issue because it's banned in 20 out of the 28 states, and there are the majority of individuals that work in cow slaughter are lower caste Hindus, often the Dalit community, commonly known as untouchable individuals, but the more appropriate term is Dalit, and Muslim Indians that make up the majority of slaughterhouses. These individuals are often vilified for working in these areas, but at the same time, upper caste Hindus refuse to work in this area, and there eventually needs to be someone that ends up dealing with cows that are left over from the dairy industry. India, despite being one of the most vegetarian countries in the world in terms of percentage, is not majority vegetarian. It is not mostly non-veg and has the second largest beef industry in the world. Sorry, I don't like using the word cattle. Cows that are not used in dairy or that have been used up in dairy often end up in slaughterhouses, either directly or through goshalas. Now, goshalas used to be cow shelters. They used to be places that were sanctuaries for cows, and specifically cows, not buffaloes, because cows have their own bovine animals have their own caste as well. Cows are considered pure and holy and worthy of protection, meanwhile buffalo are not. And cows are often subject to just roaming around the streets after farmers can no longer take care of them since they don't produce anything for them. And they either end up in goshalas, which are run by temples or local communities, but there's no government funding or even state funding in any state in India that consistently produces a safe space for cows. And even goshalas themselves, there's not physically enough space to handle all the cows that leave the dairy industry, so they'll often get rid of them by handing them over to the slaughterhouse industry. The last thing about cow slaughter in India, the way cows are protected by the law is based on their ability to be used. Responsibility of cows and buffaloes is individualized by the state, so people are responsible for protecting their own cows. But this is solely because of their use value, not according to religion. Whether it's Hindu, Muslims, Christians, anyone in India are responsible for protecting their own cow because it's considered that cows have extraordinary use value for the average citizen and can help contribute towards prosperity. Now, I need to discuss the appropriation of animal justice that's currently happening in India. This is currently occurring by the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the BJP, which promotes a Hindutva ideology. So I want to point out on the left side of the screen, you're going to see two symbols, a flower and a flag. These are right-wing symbols for the RSS and the BJP. These are just symbols to be aware of because the saffron color is often used in Hindu nationalist rallies and movements. And when discussing Hindu nationalism, we need to focus on Hindutva, which is a specific type of Hindu nationalism that advocates for an Indian state based on a Hindu nation and religion. Non-Hindus are excluded from this Indian society because they're seen as foreign invaders, and their descendants are seen as foreign invaders. Current BJP and Hindu nationalist politicians have endorsed harsh penalties for anyone that violates a cow slaughter ban, including the death penalty. And when it comes to animal justice, it's more of a welfare issue in India because only cows are quote unquote protected in India. These cows are not protected by any means. Once a cow is used up in a dairy industry or dairy household, that they can be abandoned without any repercussions for them. There's no state initiatives to take care of these cows. And like I said before, cow protection shelters, they're run by temples, they're run by locals. So this is a single issue when it comes to single rights issue when it comes to animals. This is about a very pseudo form of animal welfare for cows and has nothing to do with justice for animals overall. Now I want to discuss cow vigilantism. These individuals you see in this picture are an example of what they would look like. Just saffron colored scarves around them and decorating cows, and they refer to themselves as Gorakshaks, which means cow protectors. And they will violently uphold cow protection through the use of physical and sexual violence, financial extortion, and societal exclusion. Any individual accused of harming a cow or eating a cow can be subject to any of those forms of violence, which is often carried out by these individuals. And before I discuss anything else, I wanted to bring up a sociological concept called homo saucer and governmentality. Now, homo saucer refers to the concept of bare life, which is made by Giorgio Agamben, and it is about a body that can be killed by anyone outside the law without having to face consequences. So these individuals that allegedly harm cows can be violently harmed, societally excluded. A lot of different messed up things can happen to them, and they're participating in these actions outside of the law. I want to take a look at the three stick figures at the bottom. An individual on the left can be taken into an orange zone, which I refer to as state of exception. In this state of exception, anything is fair game to happen to them. They can be violently attacked or anything like that. And after that, they're just let go. It's a way to reinforce current state institutions, in this case, Hindutva ideology, and lower caste Hindus and non-Hindus that work in cow slaughter are often, which are hereditary professions for these groups, they're often vilified for that role. They're dragged into Hinduism through Hindutva, punished, and then excluded again. And a unique governmentality is produced where governing is occurring from afar. Any Hindutva-aligned politician can govern from afar through the use of Gorakshaks, cow protection agents, by producing violence against anyone they deem or accuse of messing up any cow. Their will and Hindu nationalist will can be inflicted upon them. I want everyone to take a look at some of these images because this is how resistance to cow slaughter bans in India have occurred. On the left, we see gentlemen protesting, stating "my food, my right." The bottom left, you see individuals in the state of Kerala that are participating in a beef eating festival. In the middle, you have an activist who's comparing using cow masks and having models wear cow masks to gain attention because it raises awareness for sexual violence that women face across India. The message is maybe if someone looks like a cow, they'll receive more attention from the state. And on the right, something a little bit more transparent, where certain communities claim that eating beef is their identity and that the ban on beef is historical ignorance. These are just some of the ways in which resistance towards cow slaughter bans have occurred. And current criminology engagement with this isn't too good, in my opinion. It's focusing on restorative justice that focuses on welfare laws to improve treatment of cows, but doesn't talk about abolishing it. There's emphasis on community collaboration and a needs approach. The issue with this is you're fundamentally asking different religious groups to kind of get along, which doesn't always work, especially not when one of them is in power. And some criminological engagement has advocated for wholly permitting cow slaughter of any kind, not just buffaloes, allowing cows to be killed in any way, anywhere, or completely banning any bovine slaughter, which I will say is radical, but then the issue comes down to the focus is only on cows. It's not to any other animal. Both of these approaches, they advocate for increased powers to the police and the surveillance state, which is already an issue in India, and for more power to the police and surveillance mechanisms so that individuals can be monitored doesn't exactly make me overly comfortable with that idea. And greater powers to individual states in determining slaughter bans doesn't really help, considering the inconsistency throughout the country that will happen in regards to how cows can be treated. Now, I come from a perspective in green criminology, which brings all the tenets of traditional criminology, but is more critical. We extend everything that regular criminology has, but we just extend that consideration to animals and land. So victimization, personhood, justice, these are all concepts that we can apply to animals and land as well. And different frameworks that dominate and exploit non-humans, both animals and the land, are examined. Now, green criminology challenges anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism is the perspective in which human interests are put before land and animals. This is the way most of the world functions right now, where development of land or farming of animals, eating them or anything like that is often framed through an anthropocentric narrative. Biocentrism is also challenged. This is the notion that all of the non-human animals' nature has intrinsic value that needs to be protected under any cost, which in theory sounds nice, but ignores how certain humans might suffer a lot of victimization and damage in the pursuit of valuing animals and land. And green criminology examines the potential of ecocentrism, something I discuss later on as something I think that is radical. Ecocentrism is the middle ground here. Actually, not the middle ground. I reject both bio and anthropocentrism. It is something that acknowledges the value in both humans and the non-human. All living things, all sentient beings, flora, fauna, they're recognized as important social actors in the globe with their own roles, and the way to find balance amongst all these entities is the endless and ongoing pursuit. Now, when it comes to slaughterhouse bans, there's some limitations simply because violence is only really addressed against the humans. With all the different forms of protest, whether it's the images, the beef festivals, the marches, it's addressing violence from Hindutva towards people. But if we look at this little image I made over here, all these red arrows that point towards animals and the environment, just using the globe, those aren't addressed. There's a bit of anthropocentrism occurring in these protests they're protesting an arguably fascist, really right-wing regime. But at the same time, we're only focusing on human identity, culture, and rights. There's no consideration of what's happening to the animals or what's happening to the land. Now, when it comes to the environmental harms, aside from what matters for the animals, discussions around beef consumption and the consumption of cow is particularly problematic because of the oversight on how problematic beef is from an environmental standpoint. I'm not just talking about carbon emissions, I'm also talking about methane emissions. Cows, as much as they might have use value, when they're mass farmed the way they are in India or anywhere in that world, are a significant contributor towards all the problems that arise from climate change. This is overlooked in the preservation of human identity, culture, and rights. And another thing about the current protests, the relationality towards animals shifts from welfarism to domination. Even if it's a very flawed and limited form of animal welfarism, the Hindutva ideology of cow protection has some semblance of care for cows, even though it's grossly misguided. To shifting this towards domination occurs by advocating for the consumption of cow, citing legal rights, cultural rights, and reproduction of maintaining one's own heritage. My argument is that the structural production of harms against humans and cows, they're only partially challenged. And I'd argue that one of the only ways to challenge this is through veganism. The same form of violence that's inflicted upon non-Hindus and lower caste Hindus that are accused of eating cow, that same kind of violence is still being reproduced. It's just humans are no longer the only ones experiencing it. Animals, specifically cows, are experiencing it. Animals that aren't cows are also experiencing it because they're ignored in discussions of welfare and animal rights. And land is suffering as a result of this as well. So for future steps, I would like to see continued scholarship from ecofeminism, critical animal studies, sociology, environmental studies, every discipline. But at the same time, every one of these disciplines ought to be having an ecocentric perspective. The consideration of both land and animals, it has to be occurring. Both land and animals are distinct, but they're at the same time interconnected and vital aspects of the non-human. I'd also like to call for more reinterpretations of Hindu mythology. A lot of my research was inspired by Yamini Narayanan, who reinterprets Hindu mythology and Hindu stories of Krishna, who's often seen as a lover of butter and a lot of dairy. She points out how a lot of upper caste Hindus point out how Krishna consumed dairy products, but they often forget that he was separated from his mother, was not allowed to consume his mother's milk, just as dairy calves in the dairy industry aren't. The reinterpretation of Hindu mythology is one way in which different forms of Hinduism might be reclaimed in an effort to protest the current narrative of what Hinduism is from the BJP. Lastly, I'd like to see collaboration from vegans working in communities that are historically marginalized by caste-based violence. And this includes working with vegans in these communities, vegans that are from Dalit communities, Muslim vegans within India, Hindu vegans in India as well, that are taking anti-caste approaches towards their activism. Thank you so much for for attending my presentation, and I wish you guys all the best in your future pursuits as we try to make academia more productive and just help out everyone around us, land, humans, animals, everyone.
Okay. All right, so I wanted to kind of vicariously say thank you to Varun for doing that. I'm glad to have his presentation as part of this, even if he's not able to be here. So as I said, we're not able to have direct questions to Varun, but if anyone would like to enter any questions in the Q&A feature, I can collect them. And if, especially if you could are willing to give any contact info, I can relay your question to Varun and see if we can get you connected with an answer. Okay, so with that being the case, then we can move on to the next presentation. And so the next presenter is Erica Carper, and Erica's presentation is titled, "Is Slavery Over? Nope. An analysis of how Jordan Peele's film Nope explores the linking of Blackness and animality as a tool to maintain white supremacy." Okay, Erica.
Thank you so much. You did well. That's a mouthful of a title. Okay, let's share the screen here. Okay. I want to start just by saying human beings are animals. This is a scientific, straightforward statement that could send many into a doomsday level spiral of panic. The animal and non-human animal dividing line has been drawn in permanent ink for thousands of years, and many are devoted to this sort of frantic race against biology to rid themselves of their own animality. However, this lack of animality is reserved only for the privileged members of society, which of course we know is the white, heterosexual, cis man. The line between Black humans and non-human animals has been made intentionally blurry by people in power who are desperate to maintain their humanity or their lack of animality. If the white man has dominion over all other animals, then amounting Blackness to animality is an easy way to maintain superiority. This was true hundreds of years ago, and I believe that it's still true today. Let's see, well, let me move my slide. Yes. Jordan Peele's film Nope acknowledges this historical connection between Black people and animality through explorations of the non-human animal and Black persons as spectacle, the non-human animal gaze, and ideas of consumption to present a powerful argument for interspecies alliances as a way to squash white supremacy's age-old tool of animalizing Blackness to maintain power. For purposes of this presentation, I'm going to be defining animality as the acknowledgement of one's animal status, or rather the acceptance of human and all other non-human animals as equals in their animalness. I find these two binaries of human, non-human animals really limiting, but that is the language that we have, so that is how I'll be defining animality. If you haven't seen this film, just a quick synopsis. It follows two Black horse ranchers, OJ and Emerald, who lose their father in an attack from an unknown alien animal that kind of flies in the sky like a UFO and consumes everything in their path. So just a little bit of background if you haven't seen this film. So Peele spends a significant amount of time addressing issues of the human and non-human gaze, which is evident in the epigraph Peele opens the film with, a verse from the Book of Nahum. I will cast abominable filth at you, make you vile, and make you a spectacle. Peele suggests that by looking at the animal, we assign them a certain level of spectacle and animality. However, in order to assert this notion of human power, we have to make animality itself vile. So I first want to look at Jupe and the way he participates and manipulates notions of the human and animal gaze. In the film, he's a child star who comes face to face with a chimpanzee, who you see here, who has just consumed the rest of his castmates while they're filming a sitcom. So they have this moment, boy and chimp staring at each other. You can see he's covered in flesh, and Jupe thinks he's going to eat him. Instead, he gives him a fist bump. Jupe decides that when the animal looked at him and decided not to eat him, he chooses him. I'm suggesting that Jupe is assigning this very human gesture of the fist bump that the chimpanzee was trained to do on set with him and making it something that's anthropomorphized. Similarly, theorist John Berger tells us that human and non-human animals do not reserve a special look for man, making Jupe's reasoning grounded in human exceptionalism and frankly white supremacy, as he continually suggests that when he looks upon the animal, the non-human animal looks back and decides not to eat him because he is chosen. Jupe takes this notion of being revered in a reciprocal gaze so seriously that he dubs this unknown alien animal that comes to consume everything in their path as the viewer, assuming that he has been chosen not just by the chimp, and this non-human alien animal, but also by society. I refer to Jupe existing as kind of the non-Black figure of the film, but I do think his casting as an Asian man is intentional. He actually owns what I would call white, maybe it's later on, I'll show you, but it's a white Western amusement park. And I think Peele is getting at Asians can maybe often be perceived as sort of a chosen minority that is closely aligned to whiteness, but the fate of Jupe in this film suggests that this is a false notion. And then in retrospect, we have our leading Black man, OJ, who realizes that to avoid becoming prey to this animal, you can't look at the alien animal. So instead of asserting dominance through the human gaze, you have to grant that respect and dignity. In general, one cannot enter in a relationship with an animal which is mutual, reciprocal, or symmetrical insofar as long as it's treated voyeuristically. Jupe feels that he has the right to profit and use this animal by allowing humans constant access to look at them, but OJ understands that being looked at is a form of violation and instead comes into an agreement with the animal in order to survive, which suggests that the practice of gazing is not only reserved for asserting dominance over non-human animals, but over Black human beings as well. Black people, like non-human animals, are often subjects of voyeurism, which can be seen as early as the 17th century, when a Khoikhoi woman was kidnapped from her home and displayed nakedly in a human zoo. This next picture is another example of the human zoo at the Brussels World Fair in 1958. And then I say, something similar to this idea of the human zoo, which often used Black human participants. We have the modern day prison tour where people are able to go through prisons and stare at inmates, which can also be an example of real life Black people viewed as spectacle. Peele kind of plays into this idea satirically by naming his leading man OJ, which is another callback to the wild spectacle of OJ Simpson, a Black man, and his murder trial. We know spectatorship naturally implies a certain level of authority, as there's power in being the viewer over a powerless subject. And in order to keep Black people at the bottom of society, white supremacists have done these things such as human zoos, and the modern day prison tour to equate them to this sort of non-human animal. They're presented as spectacles, and either way, the power dynamics remain the same as they always have, which the white person watches and the Black person is stripped of their power by being animalized. This is how the language of dehumanization becomes vital in maintaining white supremacy. To make someone other than human is to make them disposable. White cisgendered heterosexual men are afforded this human status, but everyone else receives a certain level of animality. I look to Claire Jean Kim, who declares animality as the most important weapon in white supremacy's arsenal. She suggests that because Black people are considered animals in our society, this is why they're available for dominion and manipulation. Peele suggests something similar, the way he juxtaposes these two protagonists through Jupe, kind of a natural capitalist, and OJ, a Black, shy horse rancher. So Jupe owns this Western theme park, called Jupiter's Claim, which I think is pretty ironic. But OJ doesn't have this claim or dominion. He instead owns this failing horse ranch business that he can't maintain because he's not this sort of smooth talking businessman that Jupe is. While Jupe manipulates OJ and manipulates non-human animals by buying OJ's horses with plans to feed them to the unknown animal creature for a show, and even steals the horses with the same intention. Jupe views non-human animals as disposable revenue that he can market and make a spectacle of for money, and he sees OJ in a similar way as his property. Him and his property are merely insignificant stepping stones to his success. This bears great importance in the fight against white supremacy because non-human animals become equal. When non-human animals become equal to animals, we eliminate not only the human and non-human binary, but the Black and white binary as well. I also want to talk a little bit about consumption, which is another key factor in the de-animalization of the white human. He spends a considerable amount of time in the film exploring predator and prey. So this is another shot of Gordy, the chimpanzee from the sitcom. Essentially, we see Peele dedicating these first 3 minutes of the film to remind us that we are also prey as human beings. And Val Plumwood's attack, when she becomes alligator food in her account, she talks about human supremacist culture and how we feel that we are outside and above the food chain. But in this film, Peele highlights that this is extremely false. He shows several shots of the cast eating, suggesting consumption is a way of claiming power within our own animality. And there's a really striking moment where Emerald, who's pictured, OJ's sister, declares, "If I see that praying mantis again, I'm going to eat him." Because she is frustrated that this non-human animal has taken something away from her, in this case, the ability to get this alien animal on camera, she has to claim dominion over him by threatening to eat him. Kind of this idea, we can all be predators, but we can also all be prey. Jupe, however, isn't immediately made prey by this alien presence. And Peele juxtaposes this godlike attitude Jupe takes on using OJ's father as he makes the declaration, some animals can't be tamed. This insinuates that it's highly unlikely that a Black person would ever feel they were chosen, as Jupe does, because they have experienced this idea of being prey. They understand non-human animals because they fall outside the human hierarchy of whiteness. Jupe then believes that he can exploit OJ and his animals, while OJ believes that no one deserves mistreatment or exploitation, as we are all animals. Peele makes this even clearer when OJ becomes the one to realize that the alien animal will not eat you if you do not look at it. Jupe thinks that it's his right to make a spectacle of the alien animal and use other animals as prey to do so. But OJ realized that the animal doesn't want to be looked at and respects this. Jupe declares he's chosen, and OJ instead declares something instead, saying every animal has rules. Only a Black man could figure that out, that being treated as an object of exploitation, animality, and spectacle will warrant retaliation. And only a non-Black man would be entitled enough to believe that he is the chosen species to use animals in whatever way he chooses without repercussion. Jupe's solution to taming the animal is to exploit them, gaze at them, and exercise his chosen ability to turn a profit. This is especially evident in Jupe's willingness to completely discount the lives of many forces he either purchased or stole from OJ with the intention to feed them to the alien animal. Again, non-human animals are pieces of meat and humans are exempt. OJ does not see himself as exempt, however, and blames Jupe for bringing the animal to them, saying, he got caught trying to tame a predator and you can't do that. Instead of discounting the animal as Jupe does, OJ refuses to use his horses as bait for the alien animal and instead offers to go against the animal himself. This respect and understanding of animality is how Emerald and OJ are together able to tame and defeat the alien animal that no other white person in the film could, which in my opinion is Peele's argument for interspecies alliance. Just some final thoughts here. I looked the Oxford Dictionary definition of humanness, which actually itself eludes animality, defining the word as of or connected with people rather than animals. To be an animal is the lowest thing you can possibly be, which is why for many years, white supremacists have equated Blackness to animality as it helps them maintain their power. This is why AFCO suggests that racial liberation will never find success without grappling with the situation of the animal. All of these ideas surrounding animalization affect Black humans and non-human animals, but Peele's film suggests that they do not happen separately from one another, but because of one another. Coe reminds us that race and racism have been framed as phenomena linked only to skin color, but encompasses much more than that. Racism actually thrives because of humans' obsession with the human-animal divide. However, this discovery could be our answer to the fight against white supremacy. Once we make this choice to embrace interspecies alliances and respect all animals as persons, the foundation of racist ideology actually crumbles. And though these issues of race are not as simple as I'm suggesting right now, they do have a foundation in the binary between human and animal. So if we can take steps at acknowledging this fact and begin respecting all animals as beings, we can erase this problem of animality and also move one step closer to ending white supremacy and non-human animal oppression. Frankly, I just think we should live in a world where we can all be what we actually are, which is animals. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, thanks, Erica. Okay. So if anyone has any questions for Erica, again, please type them in the Q&A box and I will relay them. So we do have one, or one already. So Erica, question for Giorgio. Have you read Afko's Racism as Zoological Witchcraft? What do you think of animality in Peele's other movies, Get Out and Us? Has anybody in critical animal studies interviewed Peele on these topics?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I read that book for my research, and she does talk about Get Out and the implications of animality in Get Out. I don't think anyone has talked to Jordan Peele using a critical animal studies lens, but I think that could be a really great conversation. Yeah, I mean, when you look at Get Out, this whole idea of the white family exploiting the Black body for their benefit, much like we do with non-human animals, which is really made evident. Coe talks about the symbolism with the deer, and again, that looking at that predator prey, and as you know, I'm kind of getting at in this paper, and as I think Jordan Peele's getting at in that movie, white humans always get to be the predator, and they never consider the fact that they're also animals who can be made prey. So yeah, I think that someone needs to be talking to Jordan Peele about these critical animal studies ideas for sure, because he's definitely participating in the dialogue.
Yeah, I think kind of chuckled when I was reading that about the interview, just because I thought it was such a good question of like, I know a number of people have written about Peele's films, and even in animal studies and critical animal studies. So I was just thinking that was a particularly probably good suggestion of actually trying to reach out and get something direct. So yeah. So there's any other questions, please type them in. Want to give a little bit of time to see if that happens. So Erica, why, I just I guess would ask you, why did you decide to study this film? You know, and well, whatever your goal was, you know, why did you want to look at this film in particular? What were you maybe looking for? Where'd this kind of you know, project or interest come from?
Yeah, so I am not in this field. You know, I took a class on critical animal studies. I had seen this film before I knew anything about these types of dialogues and theories and ideas. And I liked the movie, and I knew it was getting at something, and I wasn't quite sure what it was. And after I read Afko's Racism as Zoological Witchcraft, the ideas in the film really started to come to a head for me, thinking about, you know, consumption, predator and prey, and the language of dehumanization for Black bodies in particularly. So it was more so as I got into some of these theories, the film's ideas started coming forward to me. So it all kind of happened organically as I started my studies.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So yeah, of course, there is Afko's Racism as Zoological Witchcraft, which covers Get Out in particular. I don't think that gets to Us, the movie Us. But there is also the essay I'm gonna put in the chat in the Journal for Critical Animal Studies, where M. Shady Malaku covered Get Out and Us together. So nice rounding out with Nope here, if others might want to check that out. Okay, so a couple more questions have come in for you, Erica. So Michaela has a question. How would you understand the concept of animality in relationship with veganism?
Yeah, I think that, you know, if this idea that what we're supposed to be doing is acknowledging and embracing our animal status, then there has to become a certain respect for all animals, right? So if all animals are beings, obviously, even just that legally, if we made it so, at least in America, all animals are considered persons, you know, you can't I mean, the actual meat and dairy industry crumbles because, you know, as you know, the way animals are treated in those spaces is not up to the standard of personhood. So I definitely think this acknowledgement of animality in non-human and human animals is a really powerful tool in embracing veganism and participating in veganism.
Yeah, thank you. And so another question here about a different source. So someone asked, did you read Zakiya Iman Jackson's Becoming Human? And if yes, how do you grapple with her notion of plasticity of Blackness as encompassing the sub/superhuman?
I love that you asked me that, because someone actually, after reading this paper, asked me if I had read that, and I have not, but I've heard that it does really closely link to some of these ideas that I'm bringing forth. So thank you for bringing that up again. But yeah, the sub-superhuman idea definitely comes up in Get Out, as that's kind of why they're exploiting the Black bodies. So I think that would be definitely a good text to pair with Get Out, and yeah, with this movie as well.
Yeah, I have not read the full Becoming Human, but I read the intro. And I do know that Jackson gets into a lot of, I think, I'm pretty sure, fiction, works of fiction as well. So again, it just kind of, in a sense, a little bit like Nope too, you know, being a work of fiction, but a cultural product as well. Okay, so I don't see any more questions for the moment, but again, questions can continue in the Q&A box for anyone that has presented, if anyone thinks of any and would like to enter them. So thank you, Erica.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll move on to the next presenter, which is our last presenter for today, and that is Darren Chang, whose presentation is titled The Place of Veganism in Multi-Species Justice.
Cool.
Okay.
Am I good to go ahead?
Yeah, sorry about that. Whenever you're
Cool.
ready.
Yeah, no worries. Hi, everyone. Yeah, first I'd like to thank Nate for inviting me to be on this panel. I've just been struggling a little bit to get this fairly rough draft together. So thank you for your patience and accommodation around deadlines. Also, thank you to all the other panelists for your brilliant presentations. I don't have a PowerPoint to share. I'll just be reading from the draft. I also want to acknowledge that I am delivering this talk on the land of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation. I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded on this land. Okay, yeah, so just gonna dive right into this paper, Multi-Species Justice and Veganism. So multi-species justice is hereafter called MSJ, is an emerging field of study that aims to theorize what the inclusion of more than humans in our justice considerations might require. One group of scholars who have mapped the research terrain for MSJ trace its intellectual and political origins to animal rights, environmental justice and political ecology, post-humanism, as well as indigenous philosophies and decolonizing justice theories. Although proponents of veganism and animal liberation do exist in every intellectual tradition named, veganism has not been widely accepted as an integral part of securing justice for non-human animals in any of the traditions, with the exception of animal rights, of course, and in fact has often been critiqued and resisted within these traditions. Moreover, the diverse theories that MSJ brings together often disagree on the approaches and priorities that ought to guide us in reaching a more just world. Understanding these tensions allows us to situate veganism on at least two spheres of contention within MSJ. So the first one being kind of internal to each intellectual tradition, and the second being between each distinct intellectual tradition or theoretical positions. So in this chapter, I consider how the contentious status of veganism within MSJ might help us clarify the relations between veganism and different epistemologies, and the implications this has for organizing across divergent values and frameworks. As part of this consideration, I first engaged with Richard Twine's summary and analysis of the debates surrounding veganism within ecofeminism, particularly around the question of universalism. I argue that while the ecofeminist debates on veganism that centered around contextual veganism and vegan universalism were generative in revealing key points of tension between positions that are difficult to reconcile, as well as producing painstaking approaches that attempted to critically and creatively move beyond the impasse of the debate, both the contextual versus universal framing and an intersectional ecofeminist perspective were ultimately limited in demonstrating the dynamics of veganism across globalized and localized contexts. This limitation emanates from the fact that despite the intersectionality espoused by ecofeminists, the core frame of analysis remains stuck within a single intellectual tradition, that is feminism, and that ecofeminism lacked diversity during the specific era that the debates took place. Following from the lessons of ecofeminist debates on veganism, I propose that adopting an MSJ approach as the starting point of analysis could effectively circumvent the challenges revealed by ecofeminists. The key advantage of MSJ is that its framework allows for the recognition of a multiplicity of veganisms that either exist or has the potential to exist within any of the epistemologies that have something relevant to contribute to the goals and agenda of achieving justice across species. By examining how different veganisms might influence one another within the field of MSJ, I argue that compared to the contextual versus universal and intersectional framings that came out of the ecofeminist debates, the Gramscian concept of hegemony and counter-hegemony might be more productive in understanding the power relations and radical transformative potentials between different veganisms, as well as their relations to the broader anthropocentric and speciesist norms they seek to contest. Finally, I suggest that given the commitment of MSJ to its intellectual traditions, only veganisms meaningfully shaped by local counter-hegemonic worldviews and practices have a chance to thrive within both MSJ and the particular bodies of knowledge and communities they stand from. Okay, so first section, lessons from ecofeminist debate. In Ecofeminism, Feminist Intersections with Other Animals in the Earth, edited by Carol J. Adams and Lori Gruen, which is a great book, highly recommend. Richard Twine's chapter revisits the ecofeminist debates on veganism. Twine's overview shows ecofeminists have historically been cautious towards universalism, given their critiques of masculinist and rationalist approaches in animal ethics, which tended to be articulated in universalistic terms, disavowing the everyday lived realities and emotionality in ethical decision-making. Given the historical context where Western cultures have been globally dominant and dominated by Enlightenment rationalism, in practice, veganism and animal advocacy shaped by Western rationalist universalism risk reproducing imperialist and colonial patterns along with all the oppressive power dynamics they entail. Twine highlights examples of these oppressive tendencies in animal advocacy through critiques of various campaigns, such as Greta Gard and Claire Jung Kim's separate analyses of the conflicts between animal advocates and the Maka over the Maka whale hunt, for example. So tensions between indigenous peoples' use of animals and a mostly white dominated animal and environmental advocacy movement. I'm going to skip a little bit. There are other really great examples in there in the chapter that talks about these kinds of tensions. So in response to such issues, ecofeminists and those aligned with the tradition have opted for what they call contextual approaches to promoting veganism or advocating for animals as a means to acknowledge the socioeconomic and cultural contexts that might make animal use unavoidable and to navigate the nuances of power relations between privileged and marginalized groups in relation to changing animal use practices. However, as Twine goes on to show, the concept of contextual is itself highly contested and deployed differently among ecofeminists. On one hand, there is the position taken by those such as Dean Curtin and Marty Keel, who recognize both the contextual restrictions to practicing veganism and the compulsory nature of norms of animal consumption as universals in need to be critiqued. And therefore, they upheld vegetarianism or veganism as an ideal in ways that Twine argues is not far from universalistic, meaning an ecofeminist ethic of care that argues against the consumptions of animals under most circumstances. On the other hand, Val Plumwood's contextual approach espoused an anti-vegan stance that limited itself to opposing industrial animal agriculture, but not all animal consumption, because as Twine argues, Plumwood has incorrectly framed veganism as precluding the possibility of situating the human in ecological relations where humans and other animals are all deemed edible. Despite efforts such as Twine's To Clarify Misconceptions and Challenge Misplaced Critiques of Veganism, these seemingly irreconcilable positions have become increasingly entrenched and reflects the type of tensions over veganism in various communities and movements that continue to this day, including in fields like posthumanism and ecofeminism still. So for example, in the same collection, Susan Freeman's chapter, Tracking Feminist Interventions in Animal Studies, shows that decades since these debates have first emerged, which is around the 80s and 90s, when people started having these debates, influential posthumanist feminist thinkers like Donna Haraway continue to champion a position similar to Plumwood's, which accepts the perceived unavoidable need to use and kill animals in various contexts, or even actively supporting these violent practices, so like humane slaughter, for example. At the same time, the contemporary vegan landscape has drastically transformed since the earlier days of the ecofeminist debates due to decades of social justice advocacy work done by marginalized peoples, which has allowed predominantly privileged vegan communities and movements in the global north to become more gender, class, racially, and culturally diverse. This change is reflected in literature by the growing number of Black, Indigenous, and people of color or people of global majority vegan voices that have been published over the years. This changing reality also attests to just how much of the earlier debates regarding the place of veganism in social justice circles have been dominated by whiteness, both in within ecofeminist circles and beyond. So in my view, this whiteness is also embodied by the terms of the debates themselves, meaning that arguing within the conceptual confines of a universal contextual continuum and attempting creative ways to move past that deadlock speaks to the early ecofeminist inabilities to theorize beyond their own standpoints and their own intellectual tradition. So to be fair, I do acknowledge that it is important to remember the context of the debates that took place. So specifically with regards to the target audiences and the interlocutors that the ecofeminists were speaking back to, which is a predominantly white privileged global north intellectual community, and also the mostly white privileged animal environmental movements at the time, in order to make the animal advocacy efforts more sensitive to different nuances. I think this is where MSJ, having been conceived in an era where the composition of various intellectual traditions and cultures have become more inclusive of veganism, and where veganism itself has become more inclusive and diverse, this presents an opportunity to learn from the limitations revealed in the ecofeminist debates and altogether shift the conversation about veganism. Next section, veganism and multi-species justice. In the introduction to a symposium on the value of MSJ published in the Environmental Politics Journal, Maori political theorist Christine Winter writes that the contributors examine how MSJ can help us rethink, reorder, and revitalize the field of justice studies in order to make it more relevant to the reality of climate change impacts, ecosystem collapse, land and waterscape degradation, human ecology dependencies, and social dislocations. Winter suggests that among the strengths of MSJ is the conception's inclusion of humans. That is, it has utility for social justice too, that it addresses or has the potential to address the racial, sexual, species, ableist, colonial contract in order to enhance the foundations of justice beyond what Charles Mills describes as epistemologies of ignorance, which lies at the roots of different forms of oppression. It appears then that in terms of analysis and agenda of identifying and simultaneously trying to challenge multiple interconnected forms of oppression, ecofeminism and MSJ are practically indistinguishable. For example, Greta Gard has argued that the insights of ecology, feminism, and socialism inform ecofeminism's basic premise that the ideology which authorizes oppressions, such as those based on race, class, gender, sexuality, physical abilities, and species, is the same ideology which sanctions the oppression of nature. Carol J. Adams and Laurie Gruen have made similar statements elsewhere. And Danielle Salomaya, who's a multi-species justice scholar, and I have traced and acknowledged how ecofeminists have paved a vital foundation with profound impacts on the formation of MSJ. Yet ultimately, I think both the changes within vegan communities, as mentioned earlier, and the different starting positions between ecofeminism and MSJ matter significantly with respect to the differences in what the two theoretical frameworks could enable and accomplish. Global North feminism has always been entrapped within institutionalized privileges, such that all marginalized peoples that the ideals of feminism sought to represent have had to fight their ways to inclusion and/or visibility. This means that historically, in practice, ecofeminism advanced in an additive fashion that struggled to become increasingly inclusive and diverse when it comes to different standpoints and epistemologies. Meanwhile, having been conceived in a historical moment built on past struggles where the intellectual environment has already been made mindful to radically different epistemologies and standpoints, MSJ's commitment to diversity and multiplicity in its origin offers spaces of collaborative contestation that facilitates the engagement of all perspectives relevant to the fight for justice from the outset. This early effort at inclusion has been reflected not only in the multiple intellectual traditions that MSJ draws from, but in works such as the new edited volume, The Promise of Multi-Species Justice, which features a diverse lineup of contributors. To be clear, there is no guarantee that MSJ would succeed in maintaining its commitment to collectively reimagine justice through diverse theoretical traditions, and may very well fall short due to institutional constraints. Nonetheless, I think MSJ is currently construed in such a way that it should theoretically be a field of study as well as an intellectual and political project where a multiplicity of veganisms stemming from different traditions stand a chance to find their place and productively interact with each other and within their own traditions of knowledge. So to conceptualize how different veganisms might interact with each other within MSJ, it is crucial to first understand the development of how different veganisms happen as a process of vernacularization. So in their interrogation of how global ideas about women's rights actually get adopted and used in local contexts, Peggy Levitt and Sally Mary offer this description of their concept of vernacularization. And here are a couple of long block quotes from their paper. They say, as women's human rights ideas connect with the locality, they take on some of the ideological and social attributes of the place, but also retain some of their original formulation. We see this as analogous to the ways in which organic molecules connect with each other. New pieces attach at points of similarity, producing a new overall structure. Even though the features of the original core do not necessarily change, the new composition of elements is different. How vernacularization actually works varies according to a number of factors. These include where its communicators are located in the social and power hierarchy and their institutional positions. The characteristics of the channels and technology through which ideas and practices flow, the nature of the ideas and idea packages in which they're embedded, and the topography of the terrain in which these transfers take place. Vernacularizers take the ideas and practices of one group and present them in terms that another group will accept. This is not the work of a single person. It takes chains of actors to take these different ideas to the localities where ordinary people around the world will adopt them. They wrestle with the dilemma of presenting transnational ideas in terms that resonate with local justice theories, and at the same time are sufficiently different that they will challenge local inequalities and appeal to the imagining of the new, end quote. So my argument put simply in sequential steps is that, one, I think veganism, along with animal rights and animal liberation, have undergone and continues to go through such vernacularization process. And this process has produced an abundance of different veganisms, as discussed earlier. And three, MSJ's emphasis on multiplicity and relationality should allow the creative flow of different veganisms to constructively engage with local and non-local justice theories, free from the confines of any singular worldview, with the aim of dismantling and transforming unjust institutions across all scales and relations being the ultimate goal. The MSJ framework shifts the terms of the debate and conversation away from a rather philosophical or conceptual one about universal or contextual morality and ethics to a more political one about the interacting forces between the global and the local. Effectively, vegans working through MSJ framework can deprioritize answering the question of how we might get other communities and movements to care more about the lives of individual animals, that is, not consuming and killing them, and instead prioritize the reimagining of how vegans and veganisms might contest powers across different fronts and scales of injustices as part of broader justice movements. I propose that the Gramscian concept of hegemony is more suitable when discussing the relations between the power differences between different forms of veganism and the positions and entities that they seek to resist. Interestingly, in one paragraph in his ecofeminism chapter, Twine himself noted that, quote, hegemonic and counter-hegemonic values are increasingly transcultural. For example, cultural forms, practices, and identities inspire new socialities, such as the international animal advocacy, feminist, or the Black Lives Matter movement, which transcend conventional state boundaries, end quote. So in my opinion, by not foregrounding hegemony as a concept to think through veganism and sticking to the debate about universal versus contextual was a missed opportunity to investigate how veganism and animal advocacy have actually been transforming on the ground culturally, intellectually, and ideologically. So based on the very parameters set out for MSJ, it would appear that hegemonic forms of veganism aligning with oppressive and destructive ideologies and trends, such as those overly focused on consumption and depoliticizing veganism, would always be met with resistance and rejection within MSJ by vegans and non-vegans alike. However, by choosing to apply and amplify veganism as an indispensable tool within a counter-hegemonic toolkit, as many vegans embedded in communities and networks of resistance have already been doing, the vegan commitment to justice for all animals might find integral places within MSJ through radical articulations beyond Western or global North conceptions of animal rights or liberation. Yeah, so I'll end it there. Thanks.
All right, Darren, thank you. Excellent start. So that's so for anyone, of course, at this point, if you have any questions for Darren, please type them in the Q&A box. And while I wait a little bit for that, Darren, so this what you presented is kind of a part of an ongoing piece, right? So is there more to the idea that that you're working on here? So what you presented today, is it a bit of a truncated version?
Yeah, I definitely feel like some areas could be fleshed out a little bit more in terms of like giving more context to why this is even a relevant topic. And so part of it, I think, is just the fact that what's motivating this discussion is, we see veganism being kind of heavily scrutinized and marginalized in a lot of progressive or leftist or social justice oriented circles. And so I think multi-species justice being an emergent field that offers a lot of potential. If it continues to reproduce that dynamic, then I think it's worth critically asking, why that is, why this continues to happen. And what I'm essentially just trying to argue here is that it doesn't, right? So I think maybe a little bit more of that contextual background as to, why this is even relevant, because, yeah. And maybe some of the concepts could be defined with examples, and that might be more helpful.
Okay. Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think this is interesting because as far as I know, I think it's the first time I encountered multi-species justice, the term. And so I generally tend to try to read widely, but with your topic here, I think it's the first time. So I don't know much about the term or the concept or what's happening over there.
Right. So definitely, yeah. So it's just, yeah, I think the history of it, because essentially a group of scholars got together only a few years ago and they kind of started theorizing around this concept because it really was no other kind of name or concept they could give to this kind of collective project that it seems like people are interested in. And there is one paper published on MSJ where the authors all agree that the concept itself should be subjected to critique. So every part of multi-species justice, so the multi part, the species part, and the justice part, like what do we mean by that? And are there different competing conceptions of these things? So it's very much like a self-critical field of study that is trying to examine, what are ultimately going to be the most effective ways at achieving, like justice for humans and more than humans.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for that. I mean, I do have a couple more little questions as well. I will privilege others' questions if they come in, and do ask them ahead of mine. But because I'm very curious about this. So what's particularly unique about multi-species justice? If you're able to answer that, like what sets it apart from other sorts of like holistic approaches to overlapping oppressions? So like consistent anti-oppression, right? From like Julia Feliz or critical animal studies, since we're kind of in that space right now. What does multi-species justice do that's a different take on what these other approaches might do?
Yeah, I think that's the part where I'm trying to figure it out too in this paper, which is why I kind of feel like I got so caught up in this work that of like differentiating between ecofeminism and MSJ, because on the surface, it seems like in terms of the political agenda and the different bodies of knowledge that it's drawing from, it's just really not that different. Like the stuff that some MSJ scholars are saying now have already been said decades ago by ecofeminists, right? So I do feel like one of the key differences is reflected in just real world engagement. So I think the fact that there are indigenous scholars involved at the outset of conceptualizing MSJ is something that ecofeminism perhaps didn't have. Like when you look at who were the main scholars and thinkers who were engaged in those earlier debates, like, and I think this isn't me trying to like, point fingers or like blame whatever. It's really just institutional realities where, like academia has been oppressive. It's always been oppressive, still is very oppressive and white dominated. And so I think that is promising that the very parameters set out right at the beginning for MSJ is that it has this kind of inclusive approach. And so the question becomes a little more about, the future of multi-species justice. Is it going to reproduce some problematic institutional dynamics that becomes a little assimilationist, or is it actually going to kind of engage with all these different intellectual traditions and different worldviews in like a sincere manner? I think that's still to be seen, I guess, to be determined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay.
And precisely because it's in the early days, I think veganism has a unique opportunity to find a place within this kind of space that clearly it hasn't enjoyed in other kind of similar intersectional, coalitional type spaces elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. So remembering that it's new as I ask these questions, that the field isn't necessarily well developed yet, which is okay. And maybe even better, because like you were talking about just worrying about like what'll happen to it later on, like what happens after whatever it is, a concept becomes known in public, right? Or just how something evolves over time. It can go astray from founding principles. So sometimes the new stage can be the most exciting because they're the most maybe radical, right? Or the most according to principles, at least as they lay them out in the beginning. So I'm also just curious then, I'll make this my last one, but do you know why they choose the word justice in particular and not something else like liberation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. To be honest, I think, this is why they have suggested that, justice as a concept itself should be thought through more critically. And in fact, in the collection that I had mentioned, The Promise of Multi-Species Justice, that there are scholars involved in that project who are very critical of the concept of justice because of how historically it has been exclusionary in many ways in terms of the actual, like justice is like related institutions, like legal political institutions. And so I think the goal really is to try and at least expand our concept of justice or conception of it, and extending that beyond just the human, just because justice studies has, itself historically been extremely anthropocentric. And so just by reimagining what other subjects of justice could be included in this conversation is in itself kind of like a worthy radical act, I guess. And this relates very much to Varun's presentation, right? It's like in that case, it's criminology, you know, it hasn't historically been inclusive of non-humans or the environment, and that plays out in, you know, real advocacy efforts and stuff like that. So I think it's just a similar thing here. It just happens so that the group of scholars who were working on this were thinking about issues around justice. And I think it also has quite a bit of uptake when you think about climate justice, for example. And my understanding is like some of this early work came from Australian scholars who were really very much writing about this stuff and theorizing during the Black Summers, like during the horrible bushfires that were going on here. So I think that very much the embodied experience of facing climate catastrophes firsthand made people want to, kind of like radically rethink everything.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thanks for that. So that will be my last question. But as a sort of a half question, but not really. Would you be able to type the name of that book again into the chat? So like maybe everyone can see it, because I'm interested in it, and just because I was trying to pay attention to you, except for that detail, I forgot the title again. So it would be nice to have it there. Okay, so Darren then was our last presenter, so we can bring this event this year to a close. And so I want to say thank you for everyone that was part of this. So all of the presenters, but also all of the participants. It's great to have an audience, and for asking some questions, as well as for helping me through the technical difficulties, which I apologize for again. But want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for being part of this event. And if anyone would ever like to get involved in critical animal studies in particular, thanks, Darren. You always can. CAS is an organization that is always open to anyone that wants to be involved, and it is not a one-way street. We also want to be involved with you in whatever sorts of things you might be doing in your activist scholarly life. So we're always open. We're always looking to make connections, and always ongoing, evolving, and trying to work towards our mission of being holistic and working with others as much as we can. So with that, thanks again, and keep an eye open for future CAS events, and hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you for coming.